With nowhere left to go, she followed a map her dog seemed to trust more than she did. Miriam Hale didn't argue when they asked her to leave. There was no scene, no raised voices, just quiet decisions already made without her. 3 days later, she stood in a forgotten clearing, staring at a barn no one wanted. But the moment her German shepherd stepped inside, something changed, and he refused to leave one spot alone. What would you have done in her place? Walk away? Or step inside anyway? The clock on the wall ticked louder than it ever had before. Miriam Hale stood in the center of her living room, her hands loosely clasped in front of her, as if she had forgotten what they were meant to do. The afternoon light came in through the curtains she had sewn herself years ago, faded now, the pattern barely visible. Dust drifted in the beam of sunlight, slow and quiet, like everything else in the room. Her son Daniel stood near the doorway. He wasn't looking at her. He kept glancing at his watch, then toward the hall, then back at the stack of papers in his hand. His sister Claire sat on the edge of the armchair, back straight, one leg crossed neatly over the other. She had that same expression Miriam had seen on her before, calm, composed, already finished with the conversation before it had truly begun. "We've gone over this already, Mom," Claire said, her voice measured, almost gentle. "It's just not safe for you to be here alone anymore." Miriam blinked once. The words landed, but they didn't settle. They floated somewhere just out of reach, like something half-remembered. "I've been here for 38 years, she said quietly. Neither of them answered that. Daniel shifted his weight. "The house needs repairs. The stairs, the wiring. You can't keep up with it. We've found a better arrangement." A better arrangement. Miriam's eyes moved slowly across the room. The old wooden cabinet by the wall. The small table with the chipped corner. The photograph of her late husband still hanging slightly crooked above the fireplace. Nothing about it looked unsafe to her. It looked lived in. It looked like time. On the floor near her feet, Rex paced in a slow circle. The German shepherd's nails clicked softly against the hardwood. His ears were angled forward, alert. Every time Daniel or Claire moved, his head turned sharply, eyes fixed on them. Not aggressive, just watching, waiting. "Rex," Miriam murmured, her voice barely above a breath. He stopped immediately, stepping closer until his side pressed lightly against her leg. She rested her hand on his back without thinking. His fur was warm, solid, real. Claire exhaled, tapping the papers on her knee. "We've already signed everything. It's done. The house has been transferred. The closing is scheduled for next week." Miriam looked at her. "Transferred?" she repeated. Daniel finally met her eyes just for a second. Then he looked away again. "It was necessary. For the transition." The word hung there. Transition. Miriam felt something shift in her chest. Not sharp, not sudden. Just a slow tightening. "And where exactly?" she asked, her voice steady in a way that surprised her. "Am I supposed to go?" Claire hesitated, only for a moment. "We found a facility," she said. "It's clean, quiet. They have staff." "I'm not going to a facility." The words came out before Miriam had time to think about them. They weren't loud, but they stopped everything in the room. Daniel rubbed his forehead. "Mom, please don't make this harder than it needs to be." "Harder?" Miriam nodded slowly, as if she understood something she didn't. "Of course," she said. Silence followed. The clock ticked again. Rex shifted beside her, his body stiff now, eyes moving between the two children and Miriam's face, as if trying to read something he couldn't quite understand. Claire stood up, smoothing her coat. "We've packed what we could," she said, gesturing toward the hallway. "The rest, we'll handle." Miriam didn't ask what that meant. She didn't ask where her things would go, or how they would be handled, or why no one had asked her before deciding any of this. Instead, she turned and walked slowly down the hallway. The house felt different as she moved through it. Not empty, just already leaving her. In the bedroom, 2 bags sat neatly by the door. One was an old suitcase, the zipper slightly worn. The other was a smaller canvas bag, the kind used for overnight trips. They looked too small for a life. Miriam stood there for a moment, taking it in. Then she moved forward. She opened the suitcase. Inside were folded clothes. A sweater she recognized. A blouse she hadn't worn in years. Someone had packed for her carefully, efficiently, without asking what mattered. She reached into the dresser drawer beside the bed. It slid open with the same soft sound it always had. Inside, a few items remained untouched. A scarf, a pair of gloves, and beneath them, a photograph. She picked it up. Her younger self, her husband beside her. The children between them, small and smiling, squinting in the sun. The edges of the photo were worn from being handled too often. Miriam looked at it for a long time. Then she placed it gently into the suitcase. Behind her, Rex stood in the doorway, watching. "Come on," she said softly. He didn't move until she did. Back in the living room, Daniel had moved the bags closer to the front door. Claire was checking her phone again. Everything was already in motion. Miriam stepped into her coat slowly, her fingers working the buttons one by one. Rex stayed close, his shoulder brushing against her leg with every small movement. No one rushed her, but no one waited either. When she finally reached for the handle, she paused. Her hand rested there for just a moment longer than necessary. Then she opened the door. Cold air rushed in, sharp and immediate. It carried the faint scent of wet leaves and distant smoke. Outside, the sky had turned a pale gray, the kind that came before evening settled in. Miriam stepped out. Rex followed without hesitation. The door closed behind them with a soft, final sound. She stood on the front step, the bags at her feet, her breath visible in the cooling air. For a moment, she thought she might hear something behind her. A voice, a call, a change of mind. But there was nothing. No footsteps. No door opening. No one coming after her. Rex sat beside her, his body angled slightly toward the house, ears still alert, as if waiting for something that never came. Miriam didn't turn around. She picked up the bags and began to walk. The sound of her footsteps faded slowly down the quiet street, swallowed by the same silence that had settled inside the house she no longer belonged to. She didn't go far. Just to the end of the block, where the pavement curved slightly and the houses grew thinner, spaced farther apart. She set the bags down beside a leaning mailbox and stood there for a moment, catching her breath. Not from the walk, from everything else. Rex stayed close, his body angled toward her, eyes scanning the street, then returning to her face as if checking that she was still there. Miriam reached into her coat pocket and pulled out her phone. The screen lit up with a few missed calls she didn't recognize. No messages from Daniel, none from Claire. She stared at it for a second, then turned it off. The air had grown colder. A car passed at the far end of the street, tires humming against the road. No one slowed. No one looked. Miriam picked up the bags again. 3 days later, she sat in a room that smelled faintly of paper and something chemical. Clean, but not warm. The kind of place where voices lowered themselves without being asked. The chairs were arranged in a neat row facing a long desk. The blinds were half drawn, letting in strips of pale light that cut across the carpet. People were already seated when she arrived. Familiar faces. Not close ones. A cousin she hadn't seen in years. An aunt who barely acknowledged her with a brief nod. 2 younger relatives talking quietly to each other, their voices carrying just enough to be heard, but not enough to be considered rude. Miriam chose a seat near the back. Rex lay down beside her chair without being told, his head resting on his paws, though his eyes remained open. Watching. At the front of the room, a man in a gray suit adjusted his glasses and shuffled a stack of documents into a precise pile. He didn't look at anyone directly, just at the pages. "This won't take long," he said, almost to himself. No one responded. Miriam folded her hands in her lap. She could feel Rex's presence beside her, steady, grounding in a way nothing else in the room was. The man began reading. Names, addresses, assets. Everything was delivered in the same tone, flat, efficient, as if each word carried the same weight, no matter what it meant. A residential property located on Lake Mercer. A soft murmur passed through the front row. Someone leaned forward slightly. Another nodded. "To be transferred in full to Mr. Stephen Hale." Miriam's eyes moved slowly toward the front. Stephen. Her nephew. He smiled faintly, already calculating something in his head. The man continued. 2 investment accounts totaling more numbers, more quiet shifts in posture. To be divided equally between Claire Hale and Daniel Hale. Miriam didn't look at them. She didn't need to. She could already picture Claire's composed nod, Daniel's small, satisfied exhale. The list went on. A car, a smaller property, personal belongings assigned with surprising specificity. Everything had a place. Everything had a direction. Except... The man paused briefly, adjusting the page. "And to Miriam Hale." The room didn't turn toward her all at once. It happened in fragments, a glance, a tilt of the head, a brief flicker of attention. A parcel of land, located approximately 120 miles north of the county line. A slight rustle moved through the room. The man continued, unfazed. The property includes an existing structure, described in the documentation as a barn. The word lingered longer than the others had. Barn. Someone near the front shifted in their seat. A faint sound escaped. Half a breath, half something else. Miriam felt her face grow warm. The man went on, his voice unchanged. "The property is not currently connected to utilities. No formal appraisal has been conducted. Ownership transfers in full to Miriam Hale, effective immediately." Silence followed. Not the kind that invites conversation, the kind that settles things. Rex lifted his head. A low sound rumbled from his chest. Not loud, not aggressive, just enough to be noticed. A warning that had no clear target. A few heads turned. Is the dog? Someone whispered. It's fine, Miriam said quietly, her hand resting on Rex's neck. He stilled beneath her touch, though his gaze remained fixed forward. The man at the desk cleared his throat and moved on to the next item, as if nothing had happened. But the room had shifted. The attention that had briefly landed on Miriam drifted away just as quickly. Conversations resumed in hushed tones once the reading concluded. Papers were gathered. Chairs scraped softly against the floor. Miriam stayed seated. She wasn't sure what she was waiting for. Eventually, the man approached her, holding a thin folder. "This is yours," he said, handing it over. She took it carefully. It felt lighter than it should have. Inside were a few pages. A map printed in black and white. A simple deed. No photographs. No notes. Nothing to explain why. "Is there anything else?" she asked. The man shook his head. "That's everything listed." She nodded once. "Thank you." He moved on. Around her, people were already standing, forming small groups near the door. Conversations picked up where they had left off before the reading even began. "Lakefront. Can you imagine? We should get someone to look at the roof before winter. It's a good market right now." Miriam rose slowly. Rex stood with her immediately, his body brushing against her leg as they turned toward the exit. As she passed, she caught fragments of conversation. A glance here, a half-smile there. Her aunt's voice, light and almost amused. "Well," she said, not quite to Miriam, but not entirely away from her either. "I suppose he thought you'd appreciate something rustic." A few quiet chuckles followed. Miriam didn't respond. She kept walking. Outside, the air felt different than it had a few minutes ago. Colder, maybe. Or clearer. Rex stepped slightly ahead of her now, guiding more than following. She stopped near the curb and opened the folder. The map unfolded stiffly in her hands. A thin line traced a road that seemed to disappear into blank space. No landmarks she recognized. No nearby towns marked in bold. Just distance. And at the end of it, a small square. The barn. Miriam stared at it. It didn't look like anything. Just a shape on paper. Behind her, the door opened and closed as the others left the building, one by one. Voices drifted out, then faded as people moved toward their cars, their plans, their next steps. No one approached her. No one asked if she needed help. Rex nudged her hand gently. She looked down at him. His ears were forward again, alert, focused, not on the building behind them, on the road ahead. Miriam folded the map slowly and placed it back into the folder. Something didn't sit right. It wasn't just the barn. It was the way it had been given, the lack of explanation, the way the room had reacted, as if it meant less or more. She couldn't tell which. Rex gave a soft, low sound, almost a hum, then stepped forward, stopping just long enough to look back at her. Waiting. Miriam tightened her grip on the folder, then followed. Rex moved ahead of her by a step or two, not pulling, not rushing, just leading in that quiet way he had when he sensed direction mattered. The parking lot had mostly emptied. A few cars remained, engines starting, doors closing, people leaving with purpose. Miriam didn't have one. She reached her car slowly, the same one she had parked 3 days ago, before everything had shifted beneath her feet. The bags were already in the back seat, nothing more to add. She opened the driver's door and paused. For a second, she considered sitting there. Just sitting. letting time pass without deciding anything. But Rex was already waiting by the passenger side, watching her. She exhaled softly and got in. The next few days blurred together in a way that made it hard to measure them properly. She drove to a small public parking lot the first night, not far from where she used to shop for groceries, familiar enough to feel safe, empty enough to go unnoticed. Rex didn't lie down. He sat upright in the passenger seat, ears alert, eyes moving between shadows and passing headlights. Every time a car slowed nearby, his body tensed. Every time footsteps approached, he shifted slightly closer to Miriam. She tried to sleep, closed her eyes, opened them again. The seat didn't adjust quite right. The cold crept in slowly, through the glass, through the thin seams of the doors. Not enough to freeze, just enough to keep her from settling. At some point, she reached over and rested her hand on Rex's neck. He leaned into it immediately. That helped. A little. Morning came without announcement. Just a gradual lightening of the sky, turning the windshield pale gray. Miriam sat up slowly. Her back stiff, her hands cold. She watched people begin their routines around her. Cars arriving, doors opening, coffee cups carried carefully across the lot. No one looked at her. That, somehow, made it easier. She made calls, sat in the driver's seat with the engine off, phone pressed to her ear, listening to voices that sounded distant even when they were clear. Yes, ma'am. We have a waiting list. Approximately 8 to 10 months. We'll need a deposit to secure. We can take your name down. She thanked each one. Wrote nothing down. There was nowhere to go yet. She called an old friend once, someone she hadn't spoken to in years. The line rang longer than expected. When it was answered, the voice on the other end sounded polite. Careful. Oh, Miriam. It's been a long time. Yes, Miriam said. It has. There was a pause, a brief exchange of updates, surface level, measured. Then Miriam asked the question she hadn't wanted to ask. There was another pause, longer this time. I wish I could help, the voice said. But things are a bit complicated right now. Miriam nodded, even though no one could see her. Of course, she said. She ended the call before it could stretch further. Rex watched her the entire time. That second night, she drove farther out. Away from the familiar streets. Away from places where someone might recognize her car. The road narrowed as she went. Streetlights became fewer. Houses spaced farther apart. She pulled over near a quiet stretch lined with trees and turned off the engine. The silence was different there. Not empty. Just deeper. Rex relaxed slightly. Not fully. But enough that he shifted from sitting upright to lying across the seat, his head still raised, ears listening. Miriam leaned back, closed her eyes. Sleep came in fragments. Short stretches, interrupted by the sound of wind brushing through branches, by the faint creak of the car as it settled, by the steady awareness that she was not where she belonged. Sometime before dawn, she woke again. Rex was already awake, looking at her. There was something in his gaze she couldn't quite name. Not worry, not fear. Focus. As if he had been waiting for her to open her eyes. Miriam turned her head slowly and looked out through the windshield. The trees ahead stood still, their outlines faint in the early light. She reached into the passenger seat and picked up the folder. It had stayed there since the will reading, untouched. She opened it now. The map unfolded again, the paper stiff between her fingers. That thin line of road, that small square at the end. She stared at it longer this time, long enough for something to shift. It wasn't hope. It wasn't expectation. It was simply an option. The only one that didn't involve waiting for someone else to decide. Rex shifted beside her. His nose moved slightly, as if catching a scent that wasn't there. Then he looked forward again. At the road. Miriam folded the map carefully, set it back down. Sat still for another minute. Then she reached for the keys. The drive began without ceremony. No plan beyond the direction. The city thinned gradually behind her. Buildings gave way to smaller structures, then to stretches of open space. Gas stations appeared less frequently. The radio lost signal in brief bursts, then returned, then faded again. Miriam turned it off. The quiet inside the car felt better. Rex changed as they drove. At first, he remained alert, watching every passing vehicle, every movement along the roadside. Then, mile by mile, something in him eased. His body lowered slightly. His breathing slowed. His ears remained attentive, but no longer rigid. At one point he shifted forward, placing his front paws between the seats, looking out through the windshield as if he were trying to see further ahead. Miriam noticed. "Easy," she said softly. He didn't move back, just stayed there, watching. The road narrowed again after an hour, then again. The pavement turned rougher, the lines faded. Trees pressed closer on either side, their branches forming a loose canopy overhead. The sky dimmed slightly, filtered through leaves and distance. Miriam adjusted her grip on the wheel. She hadn't driven this far in years, not alone, not like this. She checked the map once more at a stop sign that stood alone at a quiet intersection. The line continued north. No markings beyond that. She took the turn. Time passed differently after that, measured less by distance and more by the feel of the road beneath the tires, the hum of the engine, the occasional shift in light. Rex didn't look at her anymore. He looked ahead. Steady. Certain. As if whatever lay at the end of that thin line on the map was already known to him in a way Miriam couldn't explain. She didn't question it. There was nothing else left to question. The last stretch of road turned to packed dirt. Her car slowed automatically, tires crunching softly over uneven ground. Dust lifted behind her in faint clouds, settling quickly back into place. The trees opened just enough to reveal a clearing ahead. Miriam eased off the gas. Something stood there. Not close enough to see clearly. Just a shape. Still. Waiting. Rex sat up fully now, his body tense again, but not in the way it had been before. This was different. Focused. Intent. Miriam's hands tightened slightly on the wheel. She slowed the car even more and kept driving forward. The tires crunched softly over the dirt as the clearing opened around her. What had seemed like a shape from a distance slowly took form. Lines, angles, shadows. A barn. It stood alone, slightly tilted to one side, its wood darkened by years of weather. The roof sagged just enough to suggest time had pressed down on it. Season after season. No fresh paint. No clean edges. just age. Miriam brought the car to a stop several yards away. The engine ticked as it cooled. For a moment, she didn't move. Rex was already upright in the passenger seat, his body angled toward the windshield, ears forward. His focus was locked on the barn in a way that felt deliberate. "Easy," Miriam murmured, though her voice was softer than she expected. He didn't react. The silence outside was different from the quiet she had known in the car. It wasn't empty. It held something, a thickness to it. Like sound existed, but chose not to move. Miriam opened the door. Cold air met her immediately, sharper than before. It carried the scent of damp earth, dry wood, and something faint she couldn't place. Something old, but not unpleasant. Rex jumped down beside her, landing lightly despite his size. He didn't run ahead. He stayed close, circling once, then pausing, nose lifted slightly as he tested the air. Miriam stepped forward. The ground beneath her feet was uneven, covered in patches of dry grass and compacted soil. No clear path led to the barn. No tire tracks. No signs that anyone had been there recently. Or at least, not in any obvious way. As she drew closer, the details sharpened. The boards along the outer walls were worn, but not rotting. Some were newer than others, their color slightly different, their grain tighter. Nails stood out here and there, some rusted deep into the wood, others brighter, less aged. Patches, repairs, not recent, but not forgotten either. Miriam slowed without realizing it. She reached out, almost instinctively, and let her fingers brush against one of the boards. It was cold, solid, not brittle. She pressed lightly. It held. Behind her, Rex moved past her for the first time. Not rushing, not bounding ahead. Just stepping forward with purpose, his nose close to the ground, tracing a path only he seemed to understand. "Rex!" she called quietly. He didn't stop. He circled the front of the barn, then disappeared briefly around the side. Miriam hesitated, then followed, her steps careful, her eyes adjusting to the shifting light as the structure blocked part of the sky. The side of the barn faced a slight slope. The earth rose gently, pressing closer to the wood. Here the boards looked thicker, reinforced, more deliberate. Rex stood near the corner, his body still, his tail low but not tense. He wasn't alarmed. He was assessing. Miriam came up beside him. "What is it?" she asked, though she didn't expect an answer. He glanced at her briefly, then returned his attention to the wall. After a moment, he moved again, continuing his slow circle until he reached the back. Miriam followed. The rear of the barn was partially shaded, the light dimmer, filtered through a cluster of trees that stood close enough to touch the structure. Leaves shifted softly overhead, though the wind itself was barely noticeable. She stopped a few feet away. The door was there. Large, wooden, heavy. It leaned slightly within its frame, the hinges worn but still intact. The handle was iron, darkened with age. Miriam stood in front of it, her hand hovering for a moment before she reached out. The metal was colder than the air. She wrapped her fingers around it and pulled. At first, nothing happened. Then, with a low, reluctant sound, the door gave way. It opened just enough to allow a thin strip of darkness to appear. The smell reached her first. Not decay, not mold. Something drier, Wood, dust, ash, old but not abandoned. She pulled the door wider. It opened with a long, drawn-out creak that echoed softly into the space beyond. Miriam stepped inside. The temperature dropped slightly. The air felt still, held in place. Light filtered in through small gaps in the boards, thin beams cutting through the dim interior. At first, it looked exactly like what she had expected. Empty. A wide open space with a high ceiling, wooden beams crossing overhead, shadows pooling in the corners. But then her eyes adjusted, and the emptiness shifted. There were shapes, subtle at first, then clearer. Along the walls, shelves, most empty, some holding old jars coated in dust. A few tools leaned against a support beam, their handles worn smooth. Nothing remarkable, nothing valuable. Just remnants. Except Rex had already moved ahead of her. He stood near the center of the barn now, his body angled slightly, his head lowered. His nose traced the floor, moving slowly, deliberately, as if following something invisible. "Rex," Miriam said again, softer this time. He didn't look up. He moved a few steps forward, then stopped. Miriam followed, her boots echoing faintly against the wooden planks beneath her feet. As she stepped closer, she noticed something she hadn't seen from the doorway. The floor wasn't entirely even. Some boards sat slightly higher than others. Some were newer, their edges cleaner, their placement more precise. Not random, intentional. She looked around again. The barn was old, yes, but it wasn't falling apart. It had been maintained. Not recently, but consistently. Miriam exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible. "This doesn't make sense," she murmured. Rex lifted his head. For a second, he looked directly at her. Then he turned again, scanning the space, his ears shifting, catching sounds she couldn't hear. He moved toward the far wall. Miriam stayed where she was. Her eyes moved slowly across the interior, the beams overhead, the patches in the wood, the way the light filtered in, not randomly, but through gaps that seemed placed. The feeling settled in her chest before she could name it. This wasn't just a barn. It had never been just a barn. And somehow, standing there in the quiet, with Rex already searching ahead of her, Miriam realized something without fully understanding why. This place hadn't been left behind. It had been left for someone. Rex let out a low, almost thoughtful sound from across the room. Miriam turned toward him and took another step forward. Rex was standing near the far wall now, his body angled slightly, head lowered. His nose moved across the floor in short, deliberate motions. Not random, not curious, focused. "Rex," Miriam called softly. He didn't respond. Instead, he shifted his weight and began scratching at the floor. Not hard at first, just a few quick movements. Then again, and again, the sound echoed faintly in the open space. Wood against claw, steady, repetitive. Miriam frowned. "That's enough," she said, moving toward him. "Leave it." Rex didn't stop. His scratching grew more insistent. His body leaned into it, shoulders tightening, tail stiffening slightly, not in fear, but in determination. Miriam reached him and placed a hand on his collar. "Rex." This time he paused, for a second. He looked up at her. His eyes were sharp, alert, not disobedient, just unwilling to leave. Then he lowered his head again and scratched once more. Miriam exhaled slowly. "All right," she murmured. She knelt beside him. The floorboards in that section looked no different at first glance. Same aged wood, same worn grain. But as she leaned closer, she noticed the edges. One plank sat just slightly higher than the others. Not much. Enough. She ran her fingers along the seam. There. A faint gap. Her pulse shifted, subtle but noticeable. "Hold on," she said, more to herself than to him. Rex stepped back half a pace, watching closely now, his body still tense but controlled. Miriam pressed her fingers into the gap and tried to lift. Nothing. The wood resisted. She adjusted her grip, sliding her fingers deeper into the seam, using both hands this time. The edge dug slightly into her skin as she pulled. For a moment, it didn't move. Then, a soft crack. The board lifted just enough to break its hold. Miriam paused. The sound seemed louder than it should have been. She glanced around the barn instinctively. Nothing moved. Nothing changed. Only the quiet remained. She pulled again. The plank came free slowly, the underside darker, untouched by light for years, maybe decades. A small opening revealed itself beneath. Miriam set the board aside carefully. Rex leaned forward immediately, nose hovering just above the opening, inhaling deeply, then pulling back slightly, as if confirming something. "What is it?" Miriam whispered. She couldn't see much from where she was. Only darkness. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out her phone, switching on the flashlight. The beam cut into the space below, revealing a shallow compartment. Not large, but deliberate. Inside lay a bundle wrapped in cloth. Miriam hesitated. The fabric was worn, but intact. Dust settled lightly across its surface, undisturbed until now. She reached down slowly and lifted it out. It was heavier than she expected. Rex sat beside her, watching every movement. She placed the bundle on the floor and carefully unfolded the cloth. Inside were tools, old but well kept. A small hammer, a set of nails neatly tied together with twine. A worn measuring tool, each piece placed with care, not thrown in. Miriam turned one of the tools in her hand. The wood handle was smooth from use, not abandoned, used. She set it aside gently. Beneath the tools was another layer of cloth. She peeled it back. This time, paper. Several notebooks, stacked together, their covers darkened with age. The edges were yellowed, but not brittle. Protected. Miriam's breath slowed. She lifted the top one carefully. The cover was plain, no title, no markings. She opened it. The first page revealed handwriting. Firm, steady, familiar. Her fingers tightened slightly around the edge. She didn't read yet. Not fully. Just enough to recognize. Her father's. She closed the notebook again. Not out of fear, out of pause. Rex shifted beside her, letting out a low sound, not a growl, not a whine, something softer, acknowledging. Miriam looked at him. "You knew something was here," she said quietly. He tilted his head slightly, then looked back at the opening in the floor. Miriam followed his gaze. The space beneath the plank was deeper than it had first appeared. The flashlight beam revealed more than just the bundle she had removed. The edges of the compartment extended farther, hidden beneath adjacent boards. Not just a hiding place, a system. She sat back on her heels, the notebook still in her hand. The barn felt different now. Not just quiet, occupied. Not by people, by intention. Miriam glanced around again, her eyes moving more carefully this time. The uneven boards, the patched sections, the subtle differences in texture and tone. Every detail she had noticed before now carried weight. This wasn't random. None of it was. Rex stood and took a few steps away, circling once more, but slower now, less searching, more confirming. Miriam placed the notebook back with the others, wrapping them again in the cloth. Not to hide them, to keep them as they had been. For now. She set the bundle beside her and looked at the open space in the floor. Her hand hovered above it for a moment. Then she reached down again, running her fingers along the inside edge, smooth, reinforced, built, carefully. She exhaled slowly. This wasn't just storage, she said under her breath. Rex stopped moving, looked at her. Then, without a sound, he walked a few steps farther into the barn and stopped again. Waiting. Miriam followed his line of sight. Deeper inside. There was more. She could feel it now, not see it, not yet. But feel it. And for the first time since she had stepped into the barn, something shifted inside her. Not fear, not confusion, something sharper. Curiosity. She picked up the flashlight and stood. "All right," she said softly. Rex's ears lifted slightly. Miriam looked toward the darker end of the barn and took another step forward. The beam of her phone's flashlight cut through the dimness, catching dust in the air. The farther she walked, the quieter it felt, not just in sound, but in something deeper, like the space itself was closing around her in a careful, deliberate way. Rex moved ahead, slower now, not searching, guiding. He stopped near the far end of the barn, just short of the back wall. His body stilled, head slightly lowered, ears forward. Miriam came up beside him. At first, she didn't see it. Just more wood, more shadow, more of the same weathered structure she had already taken in. But then, a line. Too straight, too clean. She stepped closer. The light revealed it more clearly now. A wall. Not part of the barn itself, built inside it. Miriam's breath caught, just slightly. The structure stood several feet in from the outer walls, forming a smaller enclosure within the larger space. The wood here was darker, smoother, fitted together with a precision the outer boards didn't have. This wasn't patchwork. This was design. Rex approached the opening without hesitation. A narrow doorway, cut cleanly, just tall enough for a person to pass through without ducking too much. He paused there for a second, looked back at Miriam, then stepped inside. Miriam followed. The change was immediate. Not warm, but not as cold. The air felt contained, held. She lowered the flashlight slightly, letting her eyes adjust. The space inside was smaller than she expected, but not cramped. One main area, with a partial division near the back. The floor beneath her feet shifted from uneven wood to stone. Flat, carefully set, each piece fitted into place. She crouched down, touching the surface. It wasn't freezing. Cool, yes, but not biting. Rex had already settled a few steps in, his body lowering to the ground with a slow, controlled movement. He exhaled once, long and steady, as if something inside him had finally relaxed. Miriam watched him. "You're comfortable here," she said quietly. He didn't move, just lay there, eyes open, calm. Miriam stood and turned slowly, taking in the details. The walls were layered. Not thick in the usual sense, but built in sections. Wood, then something packed behind it, then another layer. She pressed her hand against it. Firm, no hollow sound, insulated. Her fingers traced along the seams. Some sections were filled with material she couldn't immediately identify. Cloth, maybe, or something woven, packed tightly, deliberate. Her eyes moved to the far side of the space. A small stove sat against the wall. Old, iron. The surface marked with years of use but intact. Beside it, a shelf, simple, narrow, worn smooth along the edges. Empty now, but not abandoned. Nothing here felt abandoned. Miriam stepped closer to the stove. She reached out, hovering her hand just above it, not touching. Imagining. Heat. Light. Someone standing here feeding the fire, measuring each piece of fuel carefully. She turned again, slower this time. The entire space revealed itself in layers the longer she looked. Small details, narrow vents near the upper walls, angled in a way that suggested purpose. Not just for air, but for control, for movement. The ceiling was lower than the barn's outer structure, reinforced with beams that looked scavenged, but precisely placed. Nothing wasted. Nothing unnecessary. Miriam felt something shift inside her. A recognition. Not of the place, but of the effort behind it. This had taken time, trial, failure, adjustment. She moved toward the partial divider at the back. It separated a smaller section, barely large enough for a narrow bed or storage. She stepped into it. The air felt slightly different here, more still, more contained. She turned, shining the flashlight along the wall. Another shelf, and beneath it, more cloth, wrapped carefully. Miriam knelt slowly, her movements quieter now, more deliberate. She reached out and lifted the bundle. It was lighter than the one she had found before. She unwrapped it carefully. Inside were more notebooks, thinner this time, worn from handling. Her fingers paused on the top one, then opened it. The same handwriting, her father's. She read the first line, then the next. The words were compact, efficient, written by someone who didn't waste space or time. Not storytelling, recording. She sat down on the stone floor without realizing it, the notebook resting open in her hands. Rex shifted slightly behind her but didn't get up. The silence held. Miriam read. Fragments at first, then more. He wrote about the cold. Not as something to endure, but something to understand. About how the wind moved, how it found its way through cracks, how it could be slowed, redirected, weakened. He wrote about the first nights in the barn. Before this structure existed, before the walls held, before anything worked. Miriam's chest tightened slightly. She turned a page. More detail. More precision. How he tested materials. How some failed. How some held. How the stone beneath the floor stored heat, slowly, steadily, if treated correctly. She looked down at the floor again, then back at the page. Her breathing slowed. Another page. He wrote about silence, about learning to hear small changes, the difference between wind outside and wind inside, the difference between cold air and trapped air. Miriam closed the notebook for a moment. Her hands rested on it, fingers still. Rex stood up quietly and moved closer, lowering himself beside her again. She rested one hand on his back without looking. "You stayed here," she said softly. Not to Rex, to the space, to the man who had written these pages. The barn outside creaked faintly as the wind shifted. Inside, the sound barely reached them, muted, controlled. Miriam opened the notebook again. Her eyes moved more slowly now. Not just reading, understanding. This wasn't survival by chance. It was built, learned, earned. She turned another page and stopped. The handwriting changed slightly. Not weaker, heavier, as if pressed deeper into the paper. She leaned closer and began to read again. The light from her phone flickered slightly. She didn't notice. Outside, the wind picked up. Inside, the air held steady. Rex didn't move, and Miriam didn't look away. Not anymore. The words on the page seemed to pull her deeper the longer she sat there. Not because they were dramatic. They weren't. They were precise, measured, almost cold. Her father had written the way he had lived, carefully, without waste. Miriam turned another page. The entries shifted. Less about building, more about what came before. She read about agreements, names she recognized, business arrangements she had only heard about in passing when she was younger, conversations that had never been explained to her. Then the tone changed again. Shorter sentences, heavier ink. He wrote about losing things, not suddenly, gradually. Decisions made without him, papers signed that didn't match what he remembered. Terms that shifted in ways he hadn't agreed to. Miriam's hand tightened slightly on the notebook. This wasn't how the story had been told, not the version she had heard. Her father had always been described as stubborn, difficult, someone who refused to adapt, someone who let things fall apart. But this was something else. She closed the notebook slowly. The air around her felt different now, not heavier, clearer. Rex lifted his head beside her. His ears turned slightly toward the outer wall, then stilled. Miriam followed his gaze. "What is it?" she asked quietly. He didn't respond, but he stood, slowly, deliberately. His body shifted into a new kind of alertness, not tense, not defensive, just aware. He moved toward the wall opposite the doorway, not the one she had entered through, another section. He stopped there. His nose hovered just above the surface. Then, he tapped it lightly with his snout. Once, twice. Miriam watched him. "That again?" she murmured. Rex didn't look back this time. He scratched. Once, then again. Slower than before. More controlled. Miriam set the notebook aside. Her movements felt different now. Less uncertain. More intentional. She stood and stepped toward him. The wall looked no different from the others at first glance. Same layered wood. Same careful construction. But when she moved closer, she noticed it. A seam. Faint. Almost invisible. Her fingers traced along it. There, a slight give beneath the surface. "All right," she said softly. She pressed her palm against the panel. Nothing. She tried again, this time applying more pressure along the edge. A shift. Barely noticeable, but real. Rex stepped back slightly, watching her now, his eyes fixed on her hands. Miriam adjusted her grip, sliding her fingers into the narrow space where the panel met the frame. She pulled. The wood resisted at first. Then, a dull, quiet release. The panel moved inward. Miriam stepped back instinctively as it swung open just enough to reveal the space behind it. Dark, deeper than the first compartment. She lifted the flashlight. The beam cut into the hidden space. Not tools this time. Not notebooks. Documents. Stacked carefully. Wrapped in oilcloth. Sealed against time. Miriam reached in slowly and pulled one bundle free. The fabric was dry, intact, tied with a simple cord. She set it down on the stone floor and unwrapped it. Paper. Dozens of pages, some folded, some bound together. The top sheet bore her father's name, but not in his handwriting. Typed. Official. Legal. Miriam's breath slowed. She picked it up. Her eyes moved across the page. Contracts, agreements, signatures, her father's, and others. She recognized some of the names immediately. Family. People who had stood in that room just days ago. She turned another page. More documents, more signatures. Some consistent. Some not. Her fingers paused. Something was wrong. The handwriting didn't match. The same name. Two different signatures. Miriam leaned closer. Her pulse shifted. She flipped to another page. Dates. They didn't line up. Events that should have happened in sequence didn't. Terms that should have remained fixed had changed. Her father had written about this, not directly, but clearly. Being pushed out. Piece by piece, not by failure, by design. Miriam set the papers down slowly. Her hand rested on them for a moment. Rex remained still beside her, watching, waiting. There was more. She could feel it. She reached back into the hidden space. Another bundle, smaller, heavier. She pulled it out, unwrapped it. Inside. Bank records, old, but preserved. Account numbers, balances, withdrawals. Miriam's eyes narrowed slightly. The amounts weren't small, not at all. Money that should have been gone, or never existed, according to what she had been told. She flipped through the pages. Patterns, transfers that stopped abruptly, funds that disappeared on paper. But here, they were accounted for, protected, hidden. Miriam exhaled slowly. "This doesn't make sense," she whispered. Rex shifted beside her. Not uneasy, not alarmed, just present. She reached into the compartment again. One last item, a small box, metal, cool to the touch. She lifted it out and placed it beside the papers. It made a soft, solid sound against the stone floor. Miriam hesitated, then opened it. Inside. Cash. Neatly stacked. Bundled. Labeled. Not spent, not used, saved. She stared at it for a long moment. Her father had lived here, in this space with this, and he hadn't touched it. Rex let out a quiet breath. Miriam closed the box slowly. Her mind moved, trying to piece it together. The documents, the money, the notebooks, the structure itself. This wasn't just survival. It was preparation. For what? She didn't know yet. But it wasn't random. Nothing here was. The wind outside shifted again, pressing faintly against the outer walls of the barn. Inside, the sound barely reached them. Miriam sat back slowly. The stone beneath her felt steady, grounded. Rex lowered himself beside her once more. Calm, as if everything unfolding was exactly as it should be. Miriam looked at the open panel, at the hidden space, at everything her father had left behind. And for the first time since she had arrived, the question in her mind changed. Not what is this, but why me? She didn't have an answer, not yet. But she knew one thing with certainty. This place was never meant to be empty. And what Rex had found was only the beginning. Miriam sat there for a long time without moving. The open panel in the wall remained exposed. The documents lay spread across the stone floor. The small metal box rested beside her, closed now, but no less heavy for it. Rex stayed close, his body steady against her side. The silence inside the structure held firm, untouched by the shifting wind outside. Miriam reached for the last item she hadn't opened. The envelope. It had been tucked beneath the documents, almost hidden in the corner of the compartment. Thicker than the others. Sealed. Her name was written across the front. Not typed. Written. Her father's handwriting. She traced the letters lightly with her finger. Miriam. Simple. Direct. She hesitated. Not out of fear, out of something else. Something quieter. Then she broke the seal. The paper inside unfolded with a soft sound. Miriam held it carefully, her eyes moving to the first line. The handwriting was steady, deliberate. He had written this without hesitation, without doubt. If you are reading this, it means you came. Miriam's breath caught, just slightly. Her eyes moved to the next line. It means you stayed long enough to look. The words settled into the space around her. Not dramatic, not emotional, certain. He didn't waste time explaining things she already knew. He didn't apologize. He didn't soften anything. He wrote as he always had. Clear, precise. You were always the one who waited. Miriam frowned slightly. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the page. He wrote about the family. Not with anger, not with blame. Just observation. How they changed. How comfort made them certain. How certainty made them careless. He wrote about the years before everything fell apart. About agreements made in rooms where he had trusted the wrong people. About signatures placed beside his own that didn't belong. About decisions that were presented as final after they had already been made. Miriam closed her eyes for a moment. Not to stop reading, to hold the weight of it. When she opened them again, she continued. He wrote about losing everything, not as an event, but as a process. Slow, methodical, designed. And when it was over, he didn't fight. Not because he couldn't. Because he understood something they didn't. Miriam's gaze moved across the page more slowly now. He had seen it clearly. What had been taken, what had been hidden, what had been left. He wrote about the barn, not as a place to live, but as a place to learn. He described it simply: a structure inside a structure, protection inside exposure, control inside chaos. Miriam glanced around the space, the walls, the stone, the quiet. It all matched. He wrote about the money, why he hadn't used it, why he had divided it, hidden it, preserved it. Not out of fear, out of patience. He knew someone would come, not to take it, but to understand it. Miriam swallowed slowly. Her throat felt dry. He wrote about her, not in detail, not in memory, in observation. You never rushed to be heard. You waited until you understood. Miriam lowered the letter slightly. Her hand trembled once, then stilled. He had been watching, not closely, not constantly, but enough. Enough to know. He wrote that she would be the one left behind. Not because she was weaker, because she didn't fight for space in rooms that were already taken. Miriam exhaled softly. The words didn't hurt. They landed. He wrote that the others would take what they could see, what they could measure, what they could divide so well. And they would believe that was everything. But it wasn't. He paused there. The handwriting shifted slightly. Heavier again. The barn is not what I left you. Miriam's eyes fixed on the line. It is what I learned. The space around her seemed to settle further. The meaning moved through her slowly. Not all at once, but enough. He wrote that the money was not a gift. It was a tool. To be used only when she understood what it was for. Not to replace what was lost, but to build something that could not be taken the same way. Miriam's grip on the paper loosened slightly. She read the final lines. If you are here, then you have already begun. No signature. None needed. She lowered the letter carefully. Placed it beside her on the stone floor. Rex shifted closer, resting his head lightly against her knee. She placed her hand on his neck without looking. The barn felt different now. Not mysterious, not confusing. Clear. Everything she had seen. Everything Rex had found. The tools, the notebooks, the documents, the money. It all connected. Not in pieces. In design. Miriam looked at the open panel again. At the space behind it. At what had been hidden. Not to keep it from others. To protect it until the right person found it. Her chest rose slowly, then fell. This wasn't nothing, she said quietly. Rex didn't move. He didn't need to. Miriam looked down at the letter again, then at her hands, then at the walls around her. For the first time since she had stepped into the barn, she wasn't trying to understand what it was. She understood what it was meant to be. Outside, the wind moved through the trees. Inside, the air held steady. Miriam gathered the papers slowly, not rushing, not hesitating. Each movement deliberate. Rex stood when she did, positioning himself beside her, not in front. not behind, beside. She turned once more, scanning the space. Not searching now, seeing. The barn had never been empty. It had been waiting. And now, so was she. The shift didn't happen all at once. It came in small ways. The way Miriam stood a little straighter when she stepped outside the inner structure. The way her hands moved with more certainty as she closed the hidden panel, pressing it back into place until it fit seamlessly into the wall again. Nothing looked disturbed. Nothing suggested what lay behind it. Rex watched her the entire time. Calm, steady. When she finished, he turned toward the barn door. Not waiting, expecting. Miriam followed. The light outside had changed. The sky hung low and gray, the kind that flattened distance and made everything feel closer than it was. The air carried a sharper edge now, the cold settling in with quiet persistence. Miriam stepped out onto the uneven ground and paused. The clearing stretched out around her, unchanged. But she wasn't. Rex moved ahead, scanning the perimeter the same way he had when they arrived. His movements were familiar now, measured, controlled. He wasn't searching anymore. He was watching. Miriam took a slow breath, then another. The stillness didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt stable. She walked toward the car, the folder tucked under her arm, her steps steady. For the first time since she had left her house, she didn't feel like she was between places. She had arrived. The first call came that evening. Miriam was sitting inside the inner structure again, the letter folded carefully beside her, when her phone vibrated against the stone floor. The sound was louder than it should have been. She picked it up. The number was unfamiliar. She let it ring once, twice, then answered. "Miriam?" The voice on the other end was quick, polite, but strained. "It's your cousin, Stephen." Miriam didn't respond immediately. She hadn't expected to hear from him. "How did you get this number?" she asked. A brief pause. "We've always had it," he said. "Listen, I just wanted to check in. Make sure you're all right." The words sounded practiced. Miriam leaned back slightly against the wall. "I'm fine," she said. Another pause. "Good," Stephen replied quickly. "Good. That's good. There's been some talk about the property. The land. You know, the one you inherited." Miriam glanced toward the wall where the hidden panel sat. Unseen. Unchanged. "Yes," she said. "Well," Stephen continued, his tone shifting just slightly, "there are some people interested. Developers. Nothing official yet, but they're asking questions. It might be a good opportunity. For all of us." Miriam's expression didn't change. "For all of us?" she repeated. "You know what I mean," he said quickly. "Family. We could work something out. Split things evenly. It wouldn't make sense for you to handle something like that alone." Miriam let the silence stretch. Rex lifted his head slightly. His ears angling toward the sound of her voice. "I'm not selling," she said. Stephen hesitated. "You haven't even seen what it's worth yet." "I've seen enough." The line went quiet for a moment. Then Stephen exhaled. "Just think about it," he said. "We're trying to help." The call ended shortly after. Miriam lowered the phone slowly. Rex's eyes remained on her. "He didn't know," she said quietly. Rex didn't move. He didn't need to. the calls didn't stop. Over the next few days, more numbers appeared. Voices she recognized, some she didn't. Her aunt, her sister-in-law, even Daniel. The tone varied. Concern, curiosity, suggestion, pressure. Each conversation followed the same shape. They asked about the land, about the condition, about her plans. They spoke of responsibility, of practicality, of opportunity. Miriam answered each one the same way. Calm, brief, no. The letters came next, delivered to the small post office in the nearest town, forwarded to her through a clerk who seemed mildly surprised to see someone claiming mail from that address. Official envelopes. Law firm names printed neatly in the corner. Miriam opened them at the table inside the inner structure. Rex lying nearby, his head resting on his paws. The language was careful, measured. They raised questions, not accusations, not yet. Questions about the will, about its execution, about whether everything had been properly understood. Miriam read each one slowly, then placed them aside, one by one. Rex didn't react, but his presence shifted slightly. More alert when she read, more still when she finished. The first time someone came to the property, Miriam wasn't surprised. She had driven into town that morning for supplies, simple things, water, bread, a small lantern. When she returned, she saw the car before she reached the clearing, parked near the edge of the land, not hidden, not careful, just there. Miriam slowed the car. Rex sat up immediately. His body tensed, not aggressively, but fully engaged. Two men stood near the barn. One held a clipboard. The other pointed toward the structure, speaking quietly. They turned when they heard her approach. Miriam stepped out of the car. Rex followed, moving slightly ahead of her this time, not rushing, just placing himself between her and them. The men exchanged a quick glance. Then one stepped forward. "Ma'am," he said, his tone polite but confident. "We didn't expect anyone out here today." Miriam didn't respond right away. She let the silence settle. "This is private property," she said finally. The man smiled slightly. "Of course, we're just doing a preliminary assessment. Nothing formal." Miriam looked at him, then at the barn, then back at him. "You're trespassing," she said. The smile faded just enough to be noticeable. "We can come back with proper authorization," the other man added quickly, "if needed." Miriam didn't move. Rex stood firm, still, watching. "No," she said. The word was quiet, clear. The men hesitated, then nodded. "Understood," one of them said. They returned to their car without further argument. The engine started. The vehicle turned slowly and disappeared back down the dirt road. The clearing returned to silence. Rex remained where he was for a moment longer. Then he relaxed, stepping back toward Miriam's side. She reached down, resting her hand briefly on his back. "You knew," she said softly. He looked up at her, then toward the road again, watching. That night, Miriam sat at the table inside the inner structure. The documents were spread out before her. Not all of them, just enough. The ones that mattered. The letter from her father rested at the center. She read it again. Not searching this time, confirming. Everything he had prepared, everything he had anticipated. Even this. Miriam folded the letter carefully, then reached for the phone. She dialed a number she had written down earlier. An attorney. Recommended quietly by the clerk at the post office. The conversation was brief, practical, direct. Miriam explained what she had. The documents, the property, the situation. There was a pause on the other end. Then, "You need to protect this immediately," the attorney said. Miriam nodded. "I will." The response was sent the next day. Formal. Clear. Final. No sale. No negotiation. No shared ownership. The property remained exactly where it was. With her. The calls stopped after that. Not all at once, but enough. The tone shifted. From persuasion to distance. Miriam noticed, but didn't react. She didn't need to. The barn held. The walls remained steady. The silence returned. And for the first time, it didn't feel like something waiting to filled. It felt complete. Rex lay near the doorway, his eyes half closed, but still aware. Miriam sat inside, the documents organized, the letter folded. Everything in its place. Outside, the wind moved through the trees. Inside, nothing moved at all. And Miriam understood something without needing to say it out loud. She wasn't being asked to leave anymore. Not this time. Morning came slowly over the clearing. A pale light stretched across the ground, touching the edges of the barn first, then the trees, then finally the worn boards of the door. Frost had settled overnight, thin and uneven, clinging to the grass in scattered patches. Miriam stepped outside with a quiet steadiness that hadn't been there before. Rex followed at her side, his movements unhurried, his attention soft but present. The air was cold, but it didn't bite the same way it had on her first night. She stood there for a moment, looking at the barn from a distance, taking it in. Not as something she had been given, as something she had begun to understand. The days settled into a rhythm, not rigid, not forced, just consistent. Miriam returned to the barn again and again, each time staying a little longer. What had once felt unfamiliar slowly became known, through repetition, through small adjustments, through quiet attention. She repaired what needed repairing. Not everything, only what made sense. Loose boards were reinforced using the tools she had found. She followed the patterns her father had left behind, matching his methods instead of replacing them. When something didn't fit, she stopped, waited, and tried again. The work was slow, but it stayed. Nothing unraveled the next day. Nothing needed to be redone. Rex stayed close through all of it, sometimes watching, sometimes resting. Always aware. There were moments when he would pause near a wall or a section of floor, his ears lifting slightly, his attention drawn to something Miriam still couldn't hear. At first, she questioned it, looked where he looked, listened, waited. Eventually, she stopped asking. Not because she didn't care, because she had learned something else. Not everything needed to be explained to be understood. The inner structure changed too, not in appearance, in use. Miriam began spending her nights there. At first, cautiously, wrapped in layers, listening. But the cold never settled the way she expected. The stone floor held warmth longer than it should have. The air inside stayed still, even when the wind moved hard against the outer walls. One night, she lit a small fire in the stove, carefully. Just as the notebooks described. The heat spread slowly. Not sudden, not overwhelming, but steady. It moved through the space, settling into the stone, the walls, the air itself. Hours later, when the fire had gone out, the warmth remained. Miriam sat there, her hands resting loosely in her lap, feeling it, not questioning it, just noticing. Rex lay beside her, completely at ease. Time passed without needing to be counted. The calls had stopped. The letters had stopped. No one came back to the property. The road remained empty. The clearing remained still. Miriam didn't follow up. She didn't reach out. There was nothing left to argue. Nothing left to explain. One afternoon, she drove into town again. Not out of necessity, out of habit. The clerk at the small post office recognized her this time. Gave a short nod. Nothing more. Miriam collected her mail. A few envelopes, advertisements. Nothing urgent. Nothing demanding her attention. She stepped back outside and paused. The town moved around her in quiet ways. People passing, doors opening and closing, the faint hum of everyday life. For a moment, she felt the distance. Not from the place. From the version of herself that had once belonged there. Then it passed. She returned to the car, Rex waiting inside, and drove back. Winter settled fully a few weeks later. Snow came overnight, soft at first, then heavier, covering the clearing in a quiet layer of white. Miriam stood outside the barn that morning, watching her breath drift into the cold air. Rex moved through the snow easily, his paws pressing clean paths into the surface. She noticed something then. The ground closest to the barn wasn't frozen the same way. The snow had begun to melt slightly around the base, not dramatically, just enough to show darker earth beneath. A subtle circle, a difference. Miriam stepped closer, looked at it. Then back at the barn, the walls, the structure, the system her father had built. She didn't try to explain it. She didn't measure it. She just stood there, taking it in. Rex came to her side and sat, his body warm against her leg. She rested her hand on his back. The two of them stood in the quiet. No urgency, no pressure, just presence. Later that evening, Miriam sat inside the inner structure, the lantern casting a soft glow across the stone floor. The notebooks were stacked neatly beside her, the letter folded carefully at the top, the tools arranged within reach. Everything in its place, not hidden, not scattered, ordered. Miriam leaned back slightly against the wall. Her eyes moved across the space, not searching anymore. Seeing. The barn wasn't what she had thought it was when she first arrived. It wasn't something left behind. It wasn't something forgotten. It was something built, tested, refined, passed forward. Not in pieces, as a whole. Miriam closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them again. Rex shifted slightly beside her, adjusting into a more comfortable position. She smiled faintly. Not out of relief, not out of victory. Something quieter than that. Recognition. She had come here with nothing. Or at least, that's what it had felt like. But nothing wasn't what she had been given. She looked around once more, at the walls that held, at the floor that carried warmth, at the space that had remained steady, no matter what pressed against it from outside. Her voice was barely above a whisper. I see it now. Rex's ears lifted slightly. Miriam rested her hand on his neck. She didn't need to say anything more, because the understanding wasn't in the words. It was in everything that had led her here. Sometimes what looks like abandonment is actually protection in a form we don't recognize yet. The things that seem smallest from the outside may carry the deepest understanding, if we're willing to stay long enough to see it. The lantern flickered softly. Outside, the snow continued to fall. Inside, the space held steady, and Miriam stayed. Inside, the space held steady, and Miriam stayed.
Rex didn't move from his spot near the wall, the same place he had stopped that first day, the one she almost told him to leave. His head rested low, but his eyes were open, calm, like he had already finished the part of matter. Miriam looked around slowly, the walls her father had built, the heat still lingering in the stone, the quiet that didn't feel empty anymore. She talked about the moment she stood outside her old house with chills box and nothing that felt like hers. She had believed that was the end of everything, but Rex hadn't. He had walked in, listened, stopped where she wouldn't have stopped, insisted where she would have walked away. He didn't understand documents or betrayal or inheritance. She only knew something here, master, and he refused to ignore it. Miriam reached down, resting her hand on his back. You saw it first, she whispered. Rex didn't react. He didn't need to. Outside, the world kept moving without her. Inside, something had finally stayed. And maybe that's what changed, not what she was given, but that she stayed long enough to see it. So let me ask you this. When something in your life quietly tells you to stop or look closer, do you trust it or do you walk away?